My name is Art Athens, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the Vice Admiral Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership here at the Naval Academy. And on behalf of the Center and the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, I'd like to welcome you to the 2010 McCain Conference. This conference is made possible by the generous gift of Mrs. Cindy McCain in honor of her husband, John McCain, United States Senator from Arizona, and a member of the Naval Academy class of 1958. The Stockdale's mission is to empower leaders to make courageous, ethical decisions. And the McCain Conference is one of our premier programs. The conference's annual theme coincides with the work having been done by the Stockdale Center Fellows throughout the year and aims to bring together the best thinkers in the military and civilian communities to discuss emerging challenges in military ethics and leadership. The intent is to use this conference to develop policy recommendations for senior leaders and develop strategies for effective preparation of present and future leaders to meet these ethical leadership challenges. We will have 2 full days of discussion, debate, and reflection on a topic, the ethical ramifications of emerging military technologies, a topic that is important to our armed forces and those who support those forces around the world. I hope you enjoy yourself here in Annapolis and you meet and interact with old and new colleagues, and that you leave with a fresh perspective on our topic and ideas to implement in your sphere of influence. If there's anything that I or my staff can do to make your stay more comfortable, please let us know. I think by the end of the day we'll actually have the view we were counting on outside of the windows, but for right now you have nothing to look at, so everything will concentrate on the topic at hand. To help us to begin the discussion, debate, and reflection, I'd like to introduce our first panel moderator, Dr. Joe Thomas. Dr. Thomas is a retired Marine Corps officer, a thought leader in the field of ethical leadership, an instructor for the National Outdoor Leadership School and the Naval Academy's Lakefield Family Foundation Distinguished Military Professor of Leadership. So I'm going to ask Dr. Thomas to come on up and introduce his panel, and the other panel members are welcome to come up as well. Joe.
Good morning, everyone. Small caveat, though. It's a bit of an oversale to say that I'm an instructor with the National Outdoor Leadership School. I've yet to survive that instructor course, which starts here in a few weeks. So, but otherwise, thanks very much for the kind introduction. It's pretty fitting, I believe, for a conference that looks at the intersection of ethics and moral decision-making and emerging military technology to have a panel of true experts drawn from a variety of sectors across the spectrum of experience in emerging, developing military technology. And we've assembled just such a panel for you today. What I'll do is I'll just go down the line introducing each. Today's first session will be a simple 15 minutes from each. You'll actually be getting the high sign on your timing from a placard in the back, gentlemen. We'll do that. If we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll throw it open to question and answers. So from your right on the panel, my left, the first gentleman is Mr. Bob Bell. He has 47 years of experience in the U.S. defense industry, including vice president at Lockheed Martin and Infrared Industries, before assuming his current position as executive director, strategic alliances at iRobot Corporation. Bob's education includes the U.S. Air Force Academy, University of Rochester, and Honeywell's executive management program at Harvard. Next to Bob is Captain Paul Segrist. He's a 1983 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy with a long distinguished career in submarines. He currently serves as the director of unmanned maritime vehicles, United States Navy. Paul's education includes a master's from the Naval Postgraduate School, the submarine design course at MIT, and he has had a number of articles published in Proceedings, Submarine Review, and Jane's Intelligence Review. We are expecting, perhaps during the panel, to be joined by Dr. Allie Ryder. I'll introduce her when and if she does arrive. The third panelist is Dr. Martin DeBoer. He has been a senior management scientist at RAND since 1998, focusing on the impacts of information technology on domestic and national security. He's the author and editor of several books on information warfare and decision-making. His education includes a master's degree and PhD from UC Berkeley, and he's taught at the National Defense University in the past for about 12 years. And finally, Mr. Douglas Duroth. He's the Deputy Director of the Joint Non-Lethal Weapons Directorate at Headquarters Marine Corps. He's a retired Marine. His assignments include the Chief of Staff at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, Commanding Officer of Special Purpose MAGTAF, or Marine Air Ground Task Force Experimental, and HMM 261. His education includes degrees from Rutgers University and the Naval War College. The only rules of engagement that I'll toss out before I throw it over to Mr. Bell first is that if both our panelists and then when we do get time for questions, would keep in mind of the acronym soup that we sometimes speak in, and not everyone perhaps is ready on all the various acronyms. So a reminder, please, to be mindful of those acronyms and where possible, say the entire words. English is helpful, I guess, in this setting. So, Mr. Bell.
Thank you very much. I guess I'll just have to go ahead and speak as loud as I can. I'll just run through a series of slides. Here you can see the status of the unmanned aerial systems. The UAVs, well situated, very large market. They've gone from just reconnaissance mode to weaponized UAVs. The ground vehicle, unmanned ground vehicle market is lagging significantly behind that, but is now beginning to take off with larger numbers of UGVs in there, and of course unmanned underwater vehicles are beginning to take off as well. Here you can see the roboticized battle space today, heavily oriented towards having humans out there. Most of the UGVs are all teleoperated, but when you move to the future roboticized space, there'll be a lot fewer humans out there and a lot more UGVs operating semi-autonomously or autonomously, and in groups of UGVs, basically using swarm techniques, where groups of UGVs will get together to perform the assigned mission from the controller. The robotics industry is really made up of a lot of different areas: home, medical, military. You can see all the markets there. iRobot Corporation is about 20 years old. It was founded in 1990. When I started there a little over 7 years ago, it was 70 people. Today it's over 600 people. And in 2009, we did about $300 million worth of business. We've got our main facility in Bedford, Massachusetts, but we've got a facility in Mysore, India, an engineering facility out in California, offices in Washington, and so on. So the company is growing significantly. This basically shows the different areas for unmanned systems, of course, in the air, on the ground, and now as well undersea. We believe our work is very important. This is a postcard that we got back from an EOD technician in Iraq several years ago. It really rings a bell with all of our employees when we hear from them that we have saved lives. This is a robot, a PackBot EOD, that about 4 years ago ended up saving 4 lives. You can see all the pieces we got back in a box from in theater. They asked if we could put it back together again. The robot operator was very upset that he had lost his robot, because the operators get very personal with their robots. If they have to take it in for maintenance, they want to wait while it gets fixed, just like a mother or father in the hospital with one of their children. Here you can see all of the different mission solutions that iRobot is working on, all the way from a 1-pound robot on the left through 25 and 30-pound robots to 50-pound robots that are dealing with the IEDs in theater in Iraq and Afghanistan, then to a 250 to 300-pound class robot that can carry a 170-pound payload. And then just in the last year and a half, iRobot has gotten into the maritime unmanned undersea vehicle business. We have robots all over the world right now. You can see some of the countries we headed. Basically, our approach to developing the robots is very similar to the aircraft. Some of the older aircraft were only designed to carry 1 or 2 weapons. The F-18, for example, has a whole myriad of weapons because it's a digital architecture and system integration. We've taken the same approach with our unmanned ground vehicles, so that they're all digital architecture, all Ethernet, use all JAWS, and they all carry a multitude of different payloads. And we try to make them as toollessly as possible. PACBOT was one of the first ones that was developed first with DARPA funding and then got into Afghanistan in 2002. In 2003, we won the FCS program for the small unmanned ground vehicle, and that is using all of the techniques that we had with PACBOT and then a lot of additional ones which I'll describe. Here you can see some of the different mission payloads that get integrated with PACBOT. So we put all kinds of different sensors on there, thermal imaging, sniffers. We have FIDO operating in theater, where you can just drive the robot up to a car. It's got the PACBOT has a 7-foot arm, so you can put the FIDO sensor right into the window, and you can sniff to see if anybody had any explosive on their hand or on the steering wheel or underneath the vehicle. Here's a picture of a PACBOT EOD that had just fired its disruptor when some first responders had to go out to a suspected package. You can see when it fired the disruptor, it was right on target, but it has a little bit of a kick to it. With the small unmanned ground vehicle in the FCS program, we got the first units out in the soldiers' hands. At first, they said that this is a little toy. It's not going to do us any good in combat. And after 2 or 3 days, they found in force-on-force engagements out at Fort Bliss. They kept calling for the Sub-B for additional situational awareness. And when they finished 2 weeks of training with it, they wanted to take the robots back into theater with them. After the successful activity out at Fort Bliss, we got a lot of calls from the Army staff to testify before the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee and various other committees. Here you can see the small unmanned ground vehicle testifying at the Senate Armed Services Committee, the previous Chief of Staff. The senators are on the right, and they're all looking at a big plasma display which shows exactly what the operator sees for the robot. This is one of my favorite pictures because it's one of the few pictures I've seen of the secretary smiling. But after 5 minutes, he was driving the Sub-B around out at Fort Bliss and did a great job. Here you can see the Sub-B with some soldiers. This is basically the Sub-B that is going to be deployed. It's in production already and will be deployed with the 1st Brigade Combat Team that goes into theater in 2011. Here you can see the modularity of the Sub-B. It's got all kinds of sensors in it. I have it sitting right over here. It has a 432x zoom color, low light level camera. It's got a thermal imaging camera. Right now it's 320 by 240, but could easily be upgraded. We've got examples that fit within the same space for 4 times higher resolution. It's got low light level driving cameras, wide angle both in the head and the chassis. And as I indicated, the SUG-V, while it was originally not going to get deployed until 2015, 2016, it's now going out with the 1st Brigade Combat Team as FCS was changed into the Brigade Combat Team modernization, and most of the pieces of FCS were cut out. This is the one of the few pieces that's going into production. We've already demonstrated the operator can send images, he snaps images, sends it over a network to the FBCB2. That shows the example of multiple SUG-Vs out there in the field, as well as small UAVs. Here are some of the images that the SUG-V transmits and what the operator sees. Here it is being displayed less than a minute later after the operator took the image on the FBCB2 out in the field. They can also pass it on with the new networks that they're developing to the Tactical Operations Center. Again, some images, pretty high resolution to get the imagery quickly to the commanders in the field, including thermal images. And this is what the operator has. Basically, we use the Xbox controller and map that. We have a rugged version of the Xbox controller. It goes through salt, water, sand, you name it, rain. It's a small computer. It all goes into a backpack. It weighs about 12 pounds. We've got a stripped-down version without the backpack that the operator can have, which is 6 pounds. Here you see the stripped-down version, which is part of the mini EOD that's already in theater. It's a version of the SUG-V without the head, but with a manipulator so that they can deal with IEDs in extreme terrain. The PackBots and the Talons and all of the robots that are in theater today, they're way too heavy for the extreme terrain in Afghanistan. So we have a 28-pound robot that uses the same chassis as the SUG-V you see here, and a 6-pound controller, so that they're easily able to carry that 2 or 3 kilometers to the site of the IED that they want to look at, so that the operators stay safely out of range. Here you can see the mini EOD, the SUG-V 310 being controlled by the operator. He's got a heads-up display that's an 800 by 600 line color display, so he's got a pretty good view of the world. And here it is. You can see a good view of the manipulator that can deal with large items. And there's a camera on the arch and back. The flippers and the batteries and the manipulator arm, can all be removed toollessly. So that's one of the things we focused on, and we designed the architecture around standard Army batteries, so there'll be lots of them in the field rather than proprietary batteries. And these will, with BB-25, not 2 BB-25-90s, they'll last anywhere from 6 to 12 hours, depending on the mission, how much driving and climbing you're doing. This is some of you may have seen this on NFL Today. Some of the folks were over in Afghanistan. He's picking up a football with a manipulator. This is our bigger robot. This is a 300-pound class, and it'll take 180-pound to pick. We have already mounted several weapons on here. We've had Metal Storm on with some non-lethal firings. We've mounted a deck of 4 laser-guided weapons on here. And on the SUG-V, we now have a 4-pound laser target designator, so you can have the SUG-V out there designating the target and having the warrior go out and fire the laser-guided weapons. So we hope in the fall to have a live demonstration of that out at China Lake. More recently, we have had 2 live firings with the APOBs. Here you can see the warrior, and with its arms, you see it has a significant height to the arms, so it can actually put a small robot up on the second story of a building. A number of different applications for the large robot, including extracting wounded soldiers, putting out fires and things like that. A whole lot of applications for this type of a robot. Here you can see it picking up a 100-pound shell. Here's the family in different applications. You can use the robot in a marsupial mode with a Sub-B or other robots. This just shows the Marines APOB system, and it takes 2 soldiers to carry the APOBs out to the location where they want to set it and set it off to get rid of barriers, barbed wire, various things. We put that onto the warrior, and so the soldiers can stay 200-300 meters away from the action, and the only thing at risk is the robot. We had a live fire at China Lake last November, and then we had a live fire on Kobe Road over in Thailand in February. And everybody that's seen that loves it. So basically, one of the things that we focus on as a company is integrating with all of the different labs and the different people that develop requirements, so we come up with the best possible robots for the application. Now, here you can see our 1-pound Landroid robot. It will climb over curbs. It'll climb up a step or two. It's got a 360-degree camera. And right now we're in the process of taking that 1-pound Landroid and converting it into a 4-pound throwable robot, again with 360-degree camera, able to go up small steps as well. A lot of different applications. Here you can see that small Landroid on top of one of the 250-pound Warrior robots. The other thing that our company is focused on doing is having kits, so you can take existing vehicles, whether you want to use the vehicles for target practice. We've got kits where you can roboticize existing vehicles, and we've demonstrated a number of those in the last 2 years at various robotic rodeos. And here you can see some of our maritime undersea unmanned vehicles. And this is our most recent one, the Sea Glider, and we had our first deliveries of that last May. And of course, they can be on missions for many, many months. We focus all of our robotic and sensor and payload development into 3 different horizons. Some of you may have seen this out of one of the texts. We're really looking at long-term growth to be able to orient all kinds of different sensors, CBRN sensors, all kinds of sniffers, all kinds of additional sensors. We've got a 4-pound see-through-the-wall sensor that can be integrated onto the robot. We expect to do that later this year. We've also taken the thermal weapon sight family all the way from the light thermal weapon sight all the way to the heavy, put it on a Picatinny rail on the head of the robot, and are able to get high-resolution, long-range images from that. We're working on a flash lidar, so that is one of the keys for the road to autonomy for the vehicles. Everything right now is teleoperated, but we're working hard on pushing towards semi-autonomy and autonomy. And the flash lidar that we've developed is one of the key aspects of that. Here you can see some examples of flash lidar. in the upper right-hand corner. This just shows how we work our IR&D planning. We really look at a 4-year window. You can see all the technology, sensors coming in on the bottom, feeding into the various programs on the top, and we plan when they're going to, we'll be able to field them. And again, that's all a key part of our digital architecture. Basically, the robots have complete Ethernet networks throughout the robot, and including going through the robot you see there. The head will do a full 360 and keep spinning around, and you'll get a continuous stream of pictures. So we've got the whole digital architecture going through all kinds of slip rings and everything. And basically, to finish off, really looking where we're focused today, the operator is busy controlling the robot 80% of the time. That was the same on aircraft 15 years ago, but today's aircraft, you've got all of the systems so that you're spending 80% of your time looking at your mission objectives and only 20% of the time basically controlling the aircraft. And that's the same direction we're heading with unmanned ground vehicles. It's all teleoperated today. We're pushing to autonomy. Today, we've got 3,000 robots that are in theater. Most of them are for EOD missions. The future is to get it out there with the infantry so that they don't go in harm's way. When you breach a building with a stack of folks, you usually take some casualties. When you breach them with a robot, breach the building, send the robot in first. That's what takes the risk. Nobody has to write any letters home. Of course, soldiers will find other means for the robots. I just wanted to throw that in at the end. Basically, we use this slide in virtually every presentation we make internally within the company. We know who our customer is. That's the warfighter out there, and we want to reduce all of his risk as much as possible. Thank you.
Captain Paul Segrist, Program Manager for Unmanned Maritime Vehicles with the Navy. And unmanned maritime, for me, is underwater and on the water. I've got a counterpart who handles ground and air vehicles with the Navy, but when I talk unmanned, I talk both on and under the water. My background is a nuclear submariner, and I look at historical analogy a lot. And I want to run through quickly a historical analogy on where we are. My feeling with regard to unmanned maritime vehicles is we've got cultural challenges, not technical challenges. And so I went back, and at a conference a couple of years ago, I was told we have no compelling need for UUVs. There's no killer application. Well, let's talk about no compelling need. It's kind of like those boys, the Wright brothers. There was no killer application for aviation either. If you look at what they were flying, they flew for a couple of seconds and everybody got excited. Let's talk about some of the crazy ideas people are talking about. Talking about might be able to transport things. This is a little bit washed out, but that's a freight train. Why would you want to use an airplane to transport anything? We've got ships and trains that transport plenty of equipment. And if you look at how flimsy those things are, there's no way in the world that that contraption can carry any weight. Look at the tiny little engine it's got. Can you believe that would have any military application? So what would you use it for? Some people say scouting. Why would you use it for scouting? Remember the balloon they used during the Civil War? They put a camera on it. They could see behind the enemy lines. That was pretty slick. And we have an entire branch of the Army dedicated to scouting, the cavalry. The Navy says they use their submarines for scouting. So we in the War Department have plenty of scouting assets. Buying more would be redundant. Don't need that. Besides, you can never put a radio on the thing, so how would you talk to the pilot? Those radios are too big and clumsy to go on those airplanes, and sometimes they're just not reliable. Why would we use them to defend the shores? We've got coastal forts, we've got artillery. We don't need aircraft to do that. And besides, in open ocean, we have the battleships, which are and will always be the capital ships of all navies. How would you launch it? No way to launch them or recover them. Some people have even thought of dusting crops to kill bugs, like that would work. You might as well tell me that people will fly to the moon or travel long distances under the ocean, like in Jules Verne's novels. Yeah, right. Pictured in the middle is our first CNO, William S. Benson, Chief of Naval Operations, 1915 to 1919. In his work for the Oil Institute, Dr. Krepanevich of CSBA noted that Admiral Benson had some problems with naval aviation. And I believe his quote from his article is Benson saying, "We have no need for naval aviation." Actually, let me get the words. "The Navy doesn't need airplanes. Aviation is just a lot of noise." Ladies and gentlemen, there was a cultural reluctance to accept naval aviation. It was the last great naval transformation. As a nuke, maybe you'd expect me to say nuclear power was the last great naval transformation. That's wrong. Nuclear power provided increased capability for a capability that existed. The next great naval transformation, and I hate that word, but I haven't come up with a better one, so the next great naval transformation is unmanned systems. We're in the middle of it, and from the perspective of unmanned maritime, I think we're 10 to 15 years behind my aviation brethren. But we're learning their lessons, and as I go through my presentation, keep in mind that the biggest challenges we face, just as naval aviation did back in the 20s, they're cultural, they're not technical. So with that, if you could shift over to the other presentation, please. Okay, so today, unmanned maritime vehicles. My portfolio originally started as submarine-launched unmanned underwater vehicles. When I got involved with unmanned systems in 2005, I was first assistant program manager and then the director for unmanned systems acquisition for submarines. We have since grown into surface-launched UUVs and unmanned surface vehicles. I'll talk about these. I put at the bottom here, my charter is acquisition of warfighting systems. And so to hear iRobot have that same theme, it's completely consistent. We're trying to get things out to the warfighters. We have a couple of guiding documents. I'll just point those out. The Unmanned Undersea Vehicle Master Plan from 2004 on the right-hand side, the Unmanned Surface Vehicle Master Plan on the left. Both those are available online, and we're consistent with the DoD's Unmanned Systems Integrated Roadmap. So what's my agenda today? Talk about why unmanned, review our UUV and USV work, talk a little bit about technology development, what our changes are coming, and some things in the future. So why unmanned? We need to leverage unmanned systems in the maritime environment to achieve global persistent presence. Admiral McCullough last year at the AUVSI conference talked about the fact that we have a capacity gap and we need global presence. We need capability, and we can't increase dedicated manpower, and we need to free up the manned platforms for higher priority missions. I talked about the master plan. It is available online. I will just tell you that our vision in the Navy is the warfighting areas shown in this column when you go on to read this if you're interested online. And what we've done is we've broken up vehicles into a family of sizes. We've got man-portable, which are small, typically 3 to 9 inches in diameter. Lightweight, which is the size of a lightweight torpedo, 12 3/4 inches in diameter. Heavyweight, which is the size of a heavyweight torpedo, a submarine torpedo, 21 inches in diameter, and a large. And I'll talk about where we're going in the future here. Actually, I have an embedded video if it can show up. Not going to work. Okay, we'll just keep going then. Oh, there we go. Okay. On the submarine side, we've taken a strategic pause and we've moved to large diameter vehicles. And so we've gone away from the 21-inch development we previously had. And actually, since I've got my, if I can get the mouse back here. All right, not working. That's fine. Yep. Okay. I was going to show a video. We've actually recovered autonomously vehicles underwater from Los Angeles class submarines. We did that in 2007 from the USS Hartford. And no, that's okay. Are you going to the video? No, it's okay. Go back to the main presentation. Thank you. After that recovery, which was a risk reduction for future systems, right now we're looking at leveraging larger systems in the payloads of the Virginia large tubes. The reason for that is the size of an unmanned vehicle underwater. Volume equates to power and payload, and I'll talk a little bit more about power in a few minutes. But the larger envelope provided by large tubes gives us more flexibility, so we're working to redirect in that area. Surface ship development, a couple of pictures there of units that we're working with today. I've got a family of unmanned systems currently in mine countermeasures. Over on the far right, you see our mine warfare detachment working with one of our vehicles. They use these around the world for mine warfare, harbor surveys, and are very, very successful in developing tactics, techniques, procedures to use these systems. Down here at the bottom, we've got an advancement on the first family of vehicles. That's our Increment 2 user operational evaluation system. We build a little, learn a little, and then plow those lessons back into subsequent systems. In the center is a acquisition system that we're planning for that'll go on the littoral combat ship. Similar to the unmanned underwater systems, our unmanned surface vehicles have a master plan. Again, our mission priorities are, in this case, shown in this column. You'll notice in both the surface and unmanned underwater side, mine countermeasures is a priority. That's where we've been focusing most of our effort. I will say that in the unmanned underwater vehicle side, we're looking hard at intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance at this point as well. So in unmanned surface vehicles, we have a family of vehicles, and I'll talk about each of these individually as I go through. Okay, now let's see if we can get a video up. This is our unmanned mine hunting vehicle from Littoral Combat Ship, and it has a magnetic influence sweep system and acoustic system on the stern. You'll see it deploy in a minute. This is inside our control van. This will be operated from Littoral Combat Ship, and these screens are simulating that. We deploy a system from the stern. You'll see it deploying here in a moment. And that has, as I said, it's a Mark 104 acoustic generator with a sweep cable on it. Again, we want to use our systems to keep the operators out of the minefield. We want our systems to do the dull, dirty, and dangerous work. Right now, our means to sweep mines is to put a ship and men in the minefield and conduct sweep operations. With the Littoral Combat Ship, we'll be able to stay out of the minefield and send the unmanned vehicles downrange. This is going to bring in some of the complications that I'll talk about in a moment. And when I say complications, the areas in which it's more than just technology. It's the things like rules of the road. Rules of the road right now currently don't address unmanned systems. So how are we going to handle that? There are a number of issues associated with autonomy. Right now, what I need is fully autonomous systems. These are more what I would call waypoint planning. Now, I'll talk about that in a moment. So this is the system full up, towing the payload. Again, all unmanned. We have chase boat out there, but the vehicle is operating completely unmanned through its autonomy system. And so we're not joysticking this. Okay, you can go ahead and come out of that. The other vehicle that we use for Littoral Combat Ship is an anti-submarine warfare vehicle. It has 2 vehicles per mission package, and it is, no. Just back to the regular presentation, please. The anti-submarine warfare package consists of 2 boats with 3 payloads that can be active or passive sensors for anti-submarine warfare. In the case of my unmanned surface warfare vehicles for Littoral Combat Ship, these are all engineering development models. The intent is to put them out in the fleet, let the operators use them, get experience, and then we'll figure out where we're going to go with our production systems. And we'll take the lessons learned so that we build the right things. Okay, I'm going to go back here. All right, here we go. So these are the two vehicles, again, for littoral combat ship, the mine countermeasure, and anti-submarine warfare vehicles. Remote mine hunting system. Again, we want to get the ship and the sailor out of the minefield, and so we have a remote system that is a snorkeling vehicle. You see it there being ready to be launched. And underneath the main vehicle, we have this towfish, which is the AQS-20 sonar. It tows behind the vehicle as the vehicle snorkels. And again, this will be employed from littoral combat ship to detect and identify mines for subsequent systems to go in and neutralize the mines. Currently, although it looks as though as a system, it's tight with the sensor in the vehicle. The sensor tows about a city block behind the vehicle. So it's a interesting system. We're working on that one. CFOX is a system that was anti-terrorism force protection intended. It was a congressionally directed program, and we use this for anti-terrorism force protection. I obtained a number of these vehicles and was able to, again, through the user evaluation system, get them out to the fleet and the forces to get their evaluation. At the end of the period where their funding was expiring, I offered them to the fleet and got every one of them accepted by a various fleet entity to continue developing tactics and procedures so that we can continue our cultural integration of the systems into the fleet. Harbor Wing is another congressionally directed program, and it is using wind power, and I'll talk about energy in a second, being one of our high concern areas. This uses a hard sail and wind power to operate the autonomous vehicle. I don't have a video of this, but it is available online at Harbor Wing. If you Google Harbor Wing, you can actually see this vehicle operate. It has some interesting applications for both maritime security and sensing in both an ISR and an ocean sensing role. So what are our challenges? And when I go out to industry, these are the things that I talk about. We need standardization of our common control and architectures. I can't afford to bring a new system on, a new control system onto, for instance, littoral combat ship every time I put a new system onto that ship. So I need to be able to plug into open architecture systems. I need my systems to be modular, particularly with regard to payloads. So I need vehicle and payload standards. In the technology area, energy is my highest concern, particularly in the area of unmanned underwater vehicles. We need to go from days to weeks of endurance. Ideally, we'd like to go out to months, but in the long term, we need high-capacity energy sources that can be put safely on ships and submarines. Ideally, I'd eventually like to get just Seagrass view. I'd like to get away from shipboard launch. I'd like them to be platform independent. In the interim, we're going to rely on ships and submarines to launch them, so the energy sources need to be safe for handling on board our vessels. In the area of autonomy, I need to get away from manning. I can't just unman the system. I need to be not remotely manned. I've got to get people out of the system. And I'm going to do that through autonomy. I need one operator controlling many. I need the operator to be able to launch the system, put the system in the field, and then the system needs to be able to go out and operate. Right now we do what's called, we affectionately call it mowing the lawn. We'll go out and we'll do tracks or figure eights or whatever it is that our vehicle is programmed to do. I eventually need to get to the point where I can put vehicles out there. They'll do the obstacle and collision avoidance. They'll alert the operator if they need to be have some issue that needs operator attention. To that end, I need computer-aided detection and classification, both above and below the water, and I need cooperative behavior. The other thing that autonomy will do for me, I need robust comms, but I also need to be able to selectively, through the autonomous mission sensors on board, I need to be able to figure out what piece of information I need to transmit off the unmanned underwater or unmanned surface vehicle back to the operators. There may be some key piece of data that they need to know. The rest of it they can store. I need the system smart enough to know the difference, and that's for two reasons. One, reducing the amount of communications I need to do will help me conserve energy, particularly in the unmanned underwater side. And secondly, it'll help me conserve how much bandwidth I need on the communication side. Again, I need to be unmanned, not remotely manned. I don't want a bunch of people operating the system through joysticks. I need them to be highly autonomous systems. That's fairly easy on the underwater side because physics force me there. Unlike the unmanned surface vehicles where I can have a radio frequency link, underwater I've got to be able to have the system know its mission, be able to monitor itself, go downrange and tell me whether or not it can accomplish its mission as it gets there. And if it can't accomplish its mission, it needs to tell me and probably go to a backup target set. So what are we doing right now? From an organizational standpoint, historically, we've had a bunch of organizations who have developed various unmanned systems or underwater systems. At Navy direction, we're moving to an organization that we're calling the Advanced Development Office, UUV Advanced Development Office. I carved a couple of people out of my organization to form that up. And they basically work as the front end, developing the technology and insights to then give to me and PMS 403 for the acquisition systems. And the idea here is to rapidly get things out into the fleet, get away from the 21-inch tube limitations that had previously been on the submarine side and get things wet. We need to begin putting things in the water, let our sailors and officers use the systems. Our sailors and officers will come up with ideas that we haven't even thought of yet on how to use these systems in a warfighting sense. Large vehicles is now effectively formalized. We're away from the 21-inch UUVs into larger vehicles. Again, I need things to be platform agnostic. I can't put in boutique solutions, and I need to build a little, test a little, learn a lot. And as I said, fleet feedback will help us get there. In summary, our unmanned vehicles in general are making a difference. They're getting positive results. Challenges do remain in the hard areas, and we're working them, and these are the technical areas. It is going to be an evolutionary approach. We can get win-win results by getting things out there early to the fleet users. And as I point out here, unmanned aerial vehicles took time too. If it's a 20-year fight, I always say we're in about year 5 of the 20-year fight, so I tell my team we're going to need to get together in 15 years for the victory party. So this is what I will call the technical side of my presentation. And I haven't seen the sign yet for how much time I got left. Okay. Okay, I'll just say quickly that the things that concern me as the guy who's been doing the technical side for 3 years, I started out strictly with technical concerns when I was in APM and I was worried about recovering UUVs on submarines. However, on the cultural side, we need to get things out there into the hands of the users so they begin to get accepted. I worry about where we're going with autonomy. At some point, people have asked about weaponizing the systems. That's an area I'm not tasked to do yet. And there's an entire set of questions with regard to how you might do that, particularly underwater, because you don't necessarily have a man in the loop. And we need to look at the ramifications for things like rules of the road and how you would incorporate these systems into the naval toolkit. With that, I'll get off the stage. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Let me start off with a couple of statements here. Ground combat, naval combat, air combat. We're in space now, and all of a sudden people have come up with this notion of cyberspace. And from a legal, ethical point of view, there's a great temptation, succumbed to by many, perhaps most, to believe that it's just one more medium. That if we understand the rules of the road in the air, in the sea, on the ground, outer space, should have no problem with the rules of the road in cyberspace. Well, I'm here to tell you that it ain't necessarily so. So we have to understand combat in cyberspace as being functionally, organically, and most importantly, strategically different than combat in all the other media. Now, if you want a full treatment of this, I got one of these props. This is a 15th century prop as opposed to a 21st century prop over here. This is freely available, downloadable from the web. Just Google on the word cyber deterrence, no space in the word cyber deterrence, and you should be able to get a copy. Not without the pretty little picture, but can't be helped. What I want to do this morning is to take a few minutes and describe some of the salient features of cyberspace and cyber war as a preparation for tomorrow's panel that talks about the ethical and legal implications of combat in that medium. So, let me start off. Cyberspace, as we all know, is a man-made medium. If you've ever been exposed to that statement, you've probably heard it 100, maybe 1,000 times. What does that mean in terms of ethical and legal norms? It means physics won't help. When you talk about weapons effects and weapon systems, you can always fall back on the laws of physics to give you a sort of a first-order boundary as to what can happen under any particular condition. Well, forget physics, it doesn't apply. Some of you understand cryptography, may understand some of those rules apply, but there's only a small fraction of all the possible things that take place in cyberspace. Conventional intuition about cause and effect does not apply. I say conventional because if you've dealt with cyberspace long enough, you've probably developed your own intuition. But the kind of intuition that warfighters experience from actually fighting wars doesn't translate into cyberspace very well. Mentioned that cyberspace is a man-made medium. You've heard that a lot probably. But what you haven't heard so much about, I'm willing to bet, is that cyberspace is a man-made medium made by its defenders. There's a great deal of discretion in setting up systems as to what rules they have, what features they have, how they work, what tenets they obey. In theory, nobody should be able to get into your systems. In practice, it happens all the time. Now, what's the difference between theory and practice here? Fairly elementary. Whenever there's a disagreement about what a computer system is supposed to do, what it's been promised to do, what it's been designed to do, and the computer code that's in the system, the code is always right, 100% of the time. It's that divergence between how you think the system should behave and how the system actually behaves that creates vulnerabilities. Now, when hackers exploit these vulnerabilities, that's when you get the beginnings of cyber attack and penetration and all sorts of nasty things that other folks can do in cyberspace. Cyber war is only possible with two prerequisites. One, the other fella has to have a system. Sounds fairly obvious, but remember, that's not the same in other media, right? The other fellow does not have to have access to outer space to be affected by your platforms in outer space. The other fellow doesn't have to have ships and boats to be affected by naval power. But it is a prerequisite in cyberspace. You don't have a system, you don't have a system that anybody can get into. And the second tenet is that the ability of people to get into your system is completely a function of the errors in your system, the flaws, the vulnerabilities, coupled with the amount of exposure that you've given your system to the rest of the world. Now, you have a great deal of discretion over how much exposure you give your system to the rest of the world. And there's some non-obvious ways in which systems are exposed, and I won't get into it here. But let us say there's a great deal of discretion. Now, when you send a computer, a system, an attack, a malware, a virus, a message, whatever, okay? The system, in theory, is supposed to reject it. It's supposed to say, I can't do anything with it, or this is obviously malformed, or this isn't what I'm expecting, so I won't process it. Well, empirically, we know these systems and these messages get in all the time. And they get in through what's known as deception. Deception is the heart of cyber warfare. If there is no deception, there is no cyber warfare. There's an exception. I can go if anybody has a Q&A, but that's basically the tenet. Okay, related tenet. The vulnerabilities are more important than the weaponry. Now, when we think of nuclear war, right? How did we start off with nuclear war? Somebody developed an atomic bomb. In other words, somebody developed a weapon. Nuclear war is all about weaponry. It's not about the layout of cities. Cyber war is all about the vulnerability. Once I understand your vulnerability, if I'm a good hacker, developing an exploit against it is relatively straightforward. It's finding that vulnerability and understanding it. That's difficult. Okay, a couple of other characteristics. Most attacks have temporary effects. It's really, really hard, not impossible, but really hard to break things using a cyber attack. Okay? That, by the way, means that if you're going to use a cyber attack in combat or pre-combat situations, timing is critical. I cannot give you a cyber attack today and hope to exploit the effects the next year. Doesn't work that way. You have a relatively small window in which you can actually take advantage of a cyber attack. It's, I'm going to guess 48 hours. Don't hold me to it. It could be shorter, it could be longer. But think in terms of 48 hours, and you're going to be roughly in the ballpark. Okay. Most cyber attacks, by the way, are not inherently repeatable. That's inherent in the nature of deception, right? Fool me once, shame on me. Shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Okay? That's a characteristic of cyber war. That has to be understood. Okay, let's go to another central feature of cyber war. And remember, I'm on the technology part of the patent, not the actual ethics part of the patent here. Cyber attacks can be carried out from any platform in any location. Now, a couple variances to that. If your system can only be accessed through RF frequency, you actually have to be within RF range. But if your system is connected to any global system at all, such as the internet, such as a worldwide telephone system, such as satellites, the attacker can pretty much be anywhere also. There are literally billions of attack points. And by literally, what I mean is literally. There's about that many computers out there. There's about 4 billion cell phones out there. That ends up getting into the billions really quick. States have an edge in carrying out attacks, but states by no means have a monopoly. The folks who are good at it happen to be smart folks. Some of them work for states. States can back up smart folks with intelligence, but states are not necessarily don't have a monopoly on this. Okay, here's something interesting. The targets of national concern need not be in the country that you're attacking. I'll give you a small example. China's airline reservation system is housed on servers in the United States. If you wanted to take down China's airline reservation system, you don't even have to send your packets to China. The Chinese have done all the heavy lifting for you and moved all their packets into the United States to begin with. Now, that's not necessarily true of all infrastructures. In fact, in many ways, today it may be the minority procedure, but as we get into cloud computing, as we surely will at one or another pace, that's going to be more and more often. There is no good relationship between where you are and where your targets are. Also, cyber war capabilities cannot be destroyed by cyber war. Think about that for a minute. What does it take to carry out a cyber war? A hacker, a laptop, a few wires, some intel, none of which can be destroyed by cyber war. Maybe the laptop can be. We can go into a long discussion later. But essentially, think of it, you really can't do it that way either. Now, what does that mean? Well, okay, cyber war takes place at the speed of light, right? So somebody's attacked you, and so far you have to respond at the speed of light. And the answer is no, not really, because you're not taking out the other guy's ability to attack you. You're actually working at the speed of intuition, the speed of thought, which is a somewhat different speed. Okay. Next, ambiguity is not an artifact of cyber war. You know, the Clausewitzian fog and friction of war. Ambiguity is the primary aim of cyber war. Who did what to whom? If you're attacked, you're not necessarily going to know who attacked you. You're not necessarily going to know from where you've been attacked. If I wanted to attack you and I put enough emphasis into being undetectable, I've got a pretty good chance of succeeding. Not 100% chance, but a pretty good chance of succeeding, okay? Battle damage. Very difficult to predict battle damage. Certainly in the short term, possibly in the short term, certainly in the long term. In fact, you as a victim will not necessarily know your battle damage. Let's say I played with your files and corrupted them. Will you necessarily know exactly which file is corrupted? Will you know that any file is corrupted? You may not know until it's too late. So you've got battle damage issues on both sides of the equation. Difficulties in knowing cyber war has ended, okay? You and I are in combat. We sign an agreement. We will not carry out cyber war against one another. Then I'm faced with a cyber attack. Was it a third party, or did the guy just sign an agreement with cheated? Really hard to say. Really good guide, by the way, about starting a cyber war that you may not know whether it's ended or not. A little bit of caution here. Difficulties in knowing whether your enemies have not riddled your system with logic bombs. You've got a nice little military over there. Don't try to use it, because the minute you use it, I'm going to switch on all these levers, and all of a sudden your equipment's going to go haywire. I can't prove that I can do it, but can you prove that I haven't done it? And if you can't prove that I haven't done it, are you so eager to go to war? A lot of hinting going around here. Well, in fact, you don't even have to hint. You don't want to go to war because the Chinese did it to you, right? How do you know it was the Chinese? How do you know it wasn't the Chinese? Very difficult to do in cyberspace. Let's say you found a cyber attack weapon in your system. Was it meant to destroy your system, or was it used for espionage? Now, you may not care, but in fact, if you're talking about laws and ethics, the fact that espionage is carried out in a completely different ethical and legal regime than military attacks are, become very, very important. It's a confusing subject. You're right to be confused. I'm still confused. And I even haven't gotten into any of these wars yet, okay? What does this do to some of the laws of armed combat? I'm going to do this relatively quickly. Deception. We're not supposed to use deception, right? Well, you can't do cyber war without deception. It's inherent in cyber war that you use deception. Neutrality, right? Well, you're not supposed to let bad packets come through your country. Well, if the defender couldn't figure out what was a bad packet, how are you as a neutral going to determine what's a bad packet? You can't. Proportionality. How do you do proportionality when you cannot predict battle damage assessment? You get a rough guide. Now, just give me a minute here. Collateral damage. I know if I drop a bomb with a 100-foot radius, basically a 100-foot blast area, that things that are 500 feet away probably won't be affected very much, right? But in cyberspace, the topology is virtual. And so predicting, in fact, what's not going to get hit and what is going to get hit could be under certain types of attacks much, much more difficult than it is in physical space. Civil-military distinction, right? We've got to wear uniforms when we go to combat. You want to try to find the hacker who's in the uniform and distinguish him from the hacker who's not in the uniform? As if anybody could see his uniform from where he's sitting 1,000 miles away? By the way, this is not solely restricted. There was an article about UAVs that makes the same point. It was in the Washington Post a few weeks ago. These are the many conundra of ethics. And I hate to actually get technology mixed in with ethics. It's like I had a cousin who once said, when technology meets art, watch out, art, because technology is always going to win. But, you know, if you're going to be practical about this and actually come up with tenets that make sense, you got to pay a little attention to how these things actually work. That's enough for my comments.
Here's the definition that I would like to bring to your attention. Non-lethal weapons. Some very, very key points here. Explicitly designed. In other words, I can't bring to the acquisition community a scalable weapon that goes from non-lethality to lethal effects. It's got to be explicitly designed to incapacitate immediately. In other words, I'm not going to be involved with dropping leaflets off an aircraft onto the ground. Okay, I'm involved with munitions, technologies, weapons that will immediately incapacitate, but, and this is the important part, bring back to the pre-engagement condition that individual or that piece of equipment, okay, as it was prior to me pulling the trigger or using that particular munition. We've got two focus areas, as you can see, counter material and counter personnel. Our portfolio of science and technology efforts and acquisition efforts are in those particular areas, and you can see the deny, detect, you can see suppress, and disable. These are the issues that I was talking about briefly. If you take a look at those issues, you can see that human effects runs through each one of them. While that is not an all-encompassing list, it's a pretty full list of the things that we deal with on a daily basis in order to bring non-lethal effects to the warfighter. There's your escalation of force that we were talking about. How is it that we're going to provide that warfighter the ability to stop or determine the intent of an aggressor? So many times I have to tell you, we're reading emails, lessons learned from the field saying, if I only had the ability not to kill the individual in the room so we could determine what they were trying to do. And that's what we're trying to do with the folks that we have at the non-lethal weapons program. These next few slides give you a kind of an operational overview of what we're trying to get to and get to the counter material and counter personnel issues. If you take a look at that, these are, while it's a caricature, this is what our warfighters are dealing with today. On the counter material, roadblocks. How are we going to determine what that vehicle who is driving at a high rate of speed, whether it be a slight vehicle, heavy vehicle, a bicycle, it doesn't matter. How are we going to determine what the intent of that individual is? Can we stop it with, you know, by just yelling at them through a hailing device? Maybe a pen flare. If we engage them with what we have today is an active denial technology, which is a millimeter wave beam that produces a heat on your skin, maybe that's enough. We're trying to engage them, though, at a distance that we will be able to apply different levels of forces in order to provide the warfighter the ability to say, okay, I've done all I can before I pull my trigger on that with that lethal weapon. We're involved with taking a look at maybe stopping aircraft on the ground, stopping it on the ground, and maybe diverting it in the air. Okay, we're doing it today. In the past, we've been very, very successful with very short range. The X-26 Taser company has come out with some great technology. We've got bean bags that we've been using. We've been rubber bullets, and we're still doing some technology on how we're developing some of the materials for those rubber bullets. All good stuff. But what happens is it doesn't provide the operator the distance that he can use to say, hey, look, I don't know what, I don't have that individual's intent. I can't tell. So I'm going to automatically go and reflect to and pull the trigger with legal means. On the counter personnel side of the house, suppress people. You know, we've got some of our folks today, especially in the police forces, and even when we're talking about folks in theater today, suppressing individuals, denying folks from coming across. Okay, how do we do that? Okay, again, directed energy, I will tell you, is going to provide us, and as we do more and more technology development, we're going in towards determining that directed energy is a focus area of ours to try to provide the warfighter with some of these capabilities that they don't have today. Maritime operation view, again, what is the keep out range for some of the vessels? Okay, sound. We could use sound, directed energy, lasers. All of these are technologies that we are able to provide to our warfighters, and will continue to develop with warfighters. Some of the near-term technologies that we're going to be talking about that we continue to work on today. Upper left-hand corner is the DISLA. Basically, what that is a sound advanced hailing device coupled with a laser. So as the laser points on an individual, they're getting the advanced hailing device and the warnings at the same time. Hail and warn capabilities. We're taking a look at advanced technologies for taser-type human electromuscular incapacitators. The center right there. Although that looks like the taser right there, we've got a government waveform that we're using. And I've got a slide on that one as well. But we're trying to increase the distance and the ride time for the individual when they get hit with the electromuscular incapacitator. Advanced materials, I talked about that just a little bit. RF vehicle stopping down on the bottom. We are getting to a point where we can provide right now jolts of electricity going up into vehicles that will stop them in place. And I should say to stop the engine, but the vehicle keeps rolling. So this is a cascading event of different types of non-lethal capabilities and TTPs to provide that warfighter the capability to stop the vehicle. Entangling devices. Right now we've got lightweight entangling devices that are deployed with all our units today. We're trying to get to heavier weight So we can stop trucks at the same time, with stop light vehicles and stop trucks. In the midterm, what we're looking at is that long range I talked about, right, as far as stopping incapacitating folks at long ranges. Active denial technologies. Active denial technology right now is a very large technology. We're trying to reduce the size that it takes and reduce the weight and the cost of active denial technologies by producing different, how should I say, electrical technologies to reduce the weight. Mission payload module, the Marine Corps is in the midst right now of acquiring and producing the mission payload module, which is going to produce a flashbang capability at distance. We've got, thanks to robotics, we're able to put payloads on robotics. And we're taking a look at how to stop the vessels at longer distance. We're talking high-powered microwaves with UAVs and UGVs as well. And in the long term, nanosecond electrical pulse for long-range human electromuscular incapacitations. What that's going to do is provide a very small amount of electrical impulse onto a portion of the body to try to stop and dissuade you from further coming closer. The solid state array is going to advancing the active denial technologies to reduce the size, weight, and cost. Combining all these into a suite of technologies for the warfighter, which we're not quite there yet. Ultra short pulse lasers, being able to shoot a pulse of electricity into a door to dissuade people from coming out or staying in, so that the warfighter can maintain their position or try to figure out what the intended individuals are. And of course, we were talking about the aviation counter capability as well. And we're getting to a point where we can actually point to a laser on the wing of an aircraft to disturb the laminar flow to actually change the flight path of an aircraft. Small aircraft, UAV, but an aircraft. Thank you. Active denial system is the directed energy long-range non-lethal weapon that we were talking about. It is being deployed today. Not quite used yet in theater, but is being deployed. It is a 95 gigahertz millimeter wave that hits your skin, and it's an intolerable pain that will prevent you, that will actually make you move. Okay, once it's turned off, it goes away, and you don't feel a thing. We've got System 2 being deployed today, and we're going down into some advanced technologies like I talked about before. The solid-state ADT, active denial technology, to replace that big weapon that we just saw in the previous slide. The 40 millimeter Hemi, which is an electromuscular incapacitator, it is trying to replace the short length that we have currently with the X-26 and provide a longer length for our warfighters with a longer ride. Non-lethal munitions for flashbangs, that gets you out to about 300 meters. Ring airfoil down on the bottom there, which is a blunt trauma impact. Your MPM, which gives you a flashbang, fuel-enriched pyrotechnic. We talked about taser. And the multi-frequency radio frequency vehicle stopper. All trying to get to that one thing is providing that warfighter an ability to stop or provide some level of knowledge of what the intent of that individual is that is aggressing them. Here's that laser-based flow modification. We talked about the importance of human effects testing. I will tell you, all the work that is done by our group across the board is done with all the directives and complying with animal use, human use, and human effects testing. We have to comply with it. We get audited on a regular basis to ensure that all the laboratories that we deal with globally as well comply with those rules. We have human effects readiness boards. We've got HEAPs, which are panels that take a look at the way that we develop them and how we're going to use the weapons. So we're complying with all the directives that we have and we know about right now for the development of non-lethal weapons. We've been in for over 13 years. The department has been working non-lethal weapons. We are continuing to look at advances in non-lethal weapons, and we hope to make continued progress for our warfighters today. Okay, thank you.
So I think it's fitting today that we start with a panel on robotics, since we heard a couple great talks this morning. So I know all three of these guys. I'm going to give them a short bio. The first speaker today is Professor Ron Arkin. Met him a couple of years ago, I believe, at a Stanford conference, Technology in Wartime. He is a Regents Professor at Georgia Tech, a director of its mobile robot laboratory. He also serves as an associate dean for research. His books include Behavior-Based Robotics, Robot Colonies, and most recently, Governing Lethal Behavior in Autonomous Robots. His leading-edge research has been funded by the NSF, DARPA, U.S. Army, ONR, Honda, Samsung, SAIC, and others. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Arkin.
All right, we're here to talk about ethics today. And we're here to talk about autonomous systems as well. And hopefully this will all work for me. I have to give a somewhat abbreviated version of this talk, so bear with me if I run a little bit fast. I hope to cover the important aspects nonetheless. My background, I've been working in autonomous systems for the Department of Defense and others for a quarter of a century, pretty much. Some of the young roboticists in the audience or elsewhere may have cut their teeth on my book, Behavior-Based Robotics, and the like. And I have worked from all the way back to the autonomous land vehicle program, if you can remember that from the days of early days of DARPA and autonomous systems. But currently, I'm working with the Army Research Laboratory on a collaborative technology alliance of teams of small robots working together. I'm working with the ONR on a multi-university research initiative on bio-inspired robotic systems. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm going to be talking about a 3-year program which I recently wrapped up for the Army Research Office at the end of last year, entitled An Ethical Basis for Autonomous Systems. And this relatively small amount of research funding has brought more attention than probably all the millions and millions of dollars of research funding that I've had up to this particular point. As we know, autonomous systems and unmanned systems are the future for the military, as we heard. That culture change, I agree, is something that will occur inevitably. And some would argue that it's already occurred to some extent, perhaps not to the extent necessary to move things as rapidly as we would like. As a roboticist, though, we also have to make sure that we manage expectations that the technology needs to be nurtured along and not pushed too quickly into the field, even though there are some aspects that certainly are battle-ready as well. You see the projections by the Air Force in their recent flight plan out to 2047. The OSD roadmap goes out to 2032. The deep long-term commitment by the military into this technology is obvious. Why? Well, these are some of the reasons. One is the ability, as we heard, the need, if we heard, to have more than one warfighter manage a presence that multiplies his effectiveness in the battlefield. Not only do we want individual warfighters managing a single robot, but we want one warfighter with the capability of doing several. We want to be able to fight over greater distances and larger spaces. We want to provide the warfighter the ability to strike around the corner or to see around the corner or over the hill where they couldn't otherwise. The obvious impact, of course, in reducing friendly casualties is significant. But very little's been said, and is not been said to date regarding the impact perhaps on non-combatant casualties. What I'm going to be talking about is the potential advantage afforded by these systems, which is somewhat controversial, towards the potential reduction in non-combatant casualties over the use of human warfighters in certain very bounded, restricted circumstances in near-term situations, and by that I mean within the next 10 to 15 years, and in different types of operations other than counterinsurgency. The question is, what is autonomous? I mean, if you talk to a philosopher, we could contend that a robot will never be autonomous because it implies the use of free will. But that's not what we're talking about in this particular case. We're talking about the ability to select, detect, select, and engage a target without necessarily asking for human confirmation. And by some definition of robots, this capability already exists and has already been deployed and has been deployed for a very, very long time. Landmines, for example, which are generally considered unethical due to their lack of discriminatory capability, sense and they actuate. That is a primary definition for robotics. In other circumstances, we have those that can do discrimination, such as anti-tank mines with seismic signatures or visual signatures, and can engage targets in a much more discriminatory and legal capability. I would mention that the United States, Russia, and China, and many others are not signatories to the Ottawa Convention, which bans and prohibits landmines. But many other systems out there as well, too. Cruise missiles, by some definitions, the Aegis-class cruisers and their Navy phalanx system as well, too, has a human turning the system on, but not asking for secondary confirmation of that target once it has been recognized at that point. Many, many other systems, even the Patriot, although it has a 10-second button to turn it off after it fires, and an operator is in attendance under those circumstances, as I understand its operation, that is a question of almost being set up for assuming responsibility in an uninformed manner, because a human being can't effectively digest all the information that is present in the battlefield to intelligently allow that system to go on further. But we digress. Will there always be a human in the loop? What does it even mean to have a human in the loop? I just heard at a recent meeting at the Royal United Services Institute that the Army is now using the phrase leader in the loop. I heard the Air Force talking about human on the loop before as well. So the phraseology is changing. It's part of the culture change that's going as well. So the real question is, will it be required for a human being to verify as best as they possibly can prior to the engagement of a target, that target? Or will it be given the authority for these platforms to go and take a building using whatever force is necessary? How will that be accomplished? So, from my perspective and for many others, even my philosopher colleagues, and I don't know if Peter will second this or not, nonetheless, whether we like it or not, it appears inevitable to occur, unless, of course, international treaties end up prohibiting it. So here's the statement for you. I should have put midshipmen or sailors here. I apologize for that. Warfighters is more appropriate. But a real question here, and these are just questions, what are we doing to human beings during the process by which we battle harden them through the basic training to turn them into, I must add somewhat ineffectively if you study the literature, turn them into killers? Should robots be soldiers? Could robotic performance in the ethical domain exceed that of humans? We already have robots that are stronger. We already have robots that are faster. We already have artificially intelligent machines that are smarter than human beings. Is it unthinkable that we could create autonomous systems that could potentially outperform human beings, especially in the battlefield, and have them treat us better than we would treat each other? I contend that is a possibility, and that's the basis of the research that I was referring to. So from when I was just beginning this work, The Economist came out and did an interview. And somewhat tongue-in-cheek, they came up with this particular picture as they ran the article. But nonetheless, I do think it captures effectively the spirit of what we are trying to accomplish. Indeed, I'll be at the Joint Unmanned Systems Center of Excellence Advisory Board meeting in a few weeks talking about this to the people that are having these kinds of systems as well. So what was the goal of my particular project? Basically to give the right and the ability for a robot to make a decision regarding whether it fits within the confines of the laws of war and the rules of engagement, which are designed to fit within the laws of war, potentially monitor and report the behavior of others within the battlefield, especially regarding their ethical performance, and do this through mechanisms by which artificial intelligence can potentially lend a hand. Now, I'm not saying that this is easy. I'm saying quite the opposite. It's a very difficult and challenging problem. And I am saying that I only have taken the first baby steps towards this in terms of proof of concept in trying to make it happen. Some argue that it shouldn't happen. It's an ongoing debate, and we'll probably hear a little bit of that in a bit. But one of the things that we're trying to avoid is the potential for unethical behavior in the battlefield. It happens in every war, in every country, in every nation. Atrocities occur. And there's many reasons why they occur. There was a wonderful report that the Surgeon General's office released in 2006, which reviewed the mental health and the ethical behavior of the soldiers or the warfighters returning from Operation Iraqi Freedom. If you read it, you will find it somewhat disturbing, I suspect. I even had one colleague at an Army Sciences Board very angry with me because he couldn't believe the data that was here. But this is this is a scientific study. There's also have been less formal studies, for example, showing that virtually all of the soldiers that were engaged in heavy combat during the Vietnam War either witnessed, engaged, or abetted in atrocities. 1/3 of those that were in moderate combat did the same, and a very small amount was the case. I thought you were giving me signals. Okay, so they're coming in two different directions. I'll follow his lead. There's many reasons why this occurs. These are some of them, and it is my belief that we can design autonomous systems that do not suffer from similar failings. So, this is my plea to my colleagues as well too. I do believe that man's inhumanity to man is a crucial, important issue. In the battlefield, it is one of the worst and possible sets of scenarios that does occur. How can we use technology to reduce this? And the net effect of this is a result in non-combatant casualties, non-combatant civilian property, ideally without erosion of mission performance, because if there's going to be erosion of mission performance, it's going to be problematic to get it accepted. Here's the underlying thesis of the work. That, as I said before, robots can ultimately be more humane than human beings in military situations. No, I do not make a claim that these systems will be perfectly ethical. I do not believe that that will be the case. I believe that they will be able to make mistakes. But if they make less mistakes as benchmarks against human-level performance, what does that mean? That means saving of lives, saving of non-combatant casualties and otherwise. And to me, this is an important reason to pursue this particular goal. There are not many of us that are actually doing this, but I throw this in front of you as work that I am pleased to say the Department of Defense funded initially to carry out this particular study. So, there are many reasons why I believe that this can occur. There is no inherent right for self-defense, as guaranteed under the laws of war and the rules of engagement, the standing rules of engagement. For robots, they have the ability to act conservatively. They do not have to shoot first and ask questions later. They can assume risk, as soldiers technically are supposed to on the behalf of non-combatants. That's easy for me to say, never having served in uniform. But it's an important thing to know, that that is what is required in this case. You cannot just ignore the status of non-combatants in the battlefield. I also believe that robotic sensors that are under development, some under open development, some under covert development, black development, I guess is the best way to put it, will lead to much better understanding and the ability of these systems to see and understand the battlefield better than any human being possibly could. We can avoid certain emotions which have been shown in that Surgeon General's report and elsewhere, such as anger and desire for vengeance, that can cloud the judgment of warfighters in the engagement and fulfillment of their mission. The notion of the scenario fulfillment problem, which occurred, is believed to have occurred when the USS Vincennes took out an Iranian airliner, where you get what's called a form of premature cognitive closure, such as you're told a bad guy is coming around the corner, you have information from that, you're primed, and when that bad guy comes around the corner, you fire the shot without necessarily doing due diligence. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, nor should it be the case with this form of autonomous system. We can integrate more information far faster if the concept of network-centric warfare indeed does succeed. I have some questions about whether it is going to succeed and the risks that it potentially poses, but if that is the vision of the future and it can be pulled off, there is a place for assigning more authority to autonomous systems in that, and the global information grid as well. And as I mentioned before, the ability to monitor ethical performance. There are many reasons against autonomy. I'll let Peter go through them, as he always does, after I talk. Many others, I am not ignorant of them. The assumption of responsibility, the use ad bellum arguments dealing with the entry into warfare, the notion of whether risk-free warfare is unjust, and the jury is out on that. Some just say it's too hard. It can't be done. Well, we couldn't fly either at one point in time. The effect on squad cohesion is one point that the military often brings up. What about the band of brothers effect? If you have someone that's actually going to tell on you, without a doubt, will you start fragging the robot? Will you get those parts sent back to iRobot, which were caused by friendlies as opposed to enemies? The Terminator vision I dismiss, the ability to refuse an order. We ease that somewhat by allowing for the introduction of overrides, but making those overrides explicit with additional responsibility attribution and two key acceptance. And a variety of other things as well too, but I'll let Peter tell me why I'm doing this. Not good. So, these are the things that are enshrined within the Geneva Convention and the laws of war, laws of armed conflict, if you prefer that language. I use them interchangeably. Military necessity, humanity, necessary suffering, proportionality test, and discrimination or distinction. The system has to be capable of doing that. I'm not going to go into the technical details, this is the wrong audience for that, in terms of how we implemented these sorts of things in the system, but we make sure that, again, permission to kill alone is inadequate. There must be an obligation that is derived from the laws from the rules of engagement to do that. There also must be no existing prohibitions as encoded from the laws of war, keeping in mind, again, that these are for narrow missions under bounded morality, such as a counter-sniper operation or a building clearing operation, not to replace the entire moral infrastructure as assumed by a typical human being. That's not what I'm talking about here. Different tactics can be used, as we saw. I don't know if fishing would be appropriate, but different tactics can be used to encourage surrender. You can require stronger evidence of hostility or hostile intent, which is the prima facie reason for engaging a target in the first place. No lingering anger. We can guarantee there is never an intent to target a non-combatant. It's kind of hard to examine a human mind for that post facto, but it is not hard to examine what's in the software of a robotic system. I believe the proportionality can be more effectively interpreted within the field, whenever lethality is deployed, that can trigger an ethical signal back to the Pentagon and the JAG office for subsequent evaluation if needed as well too. And again, adhering to this principle of first do no harm, which is the antithesis of the shoot first and ask questions later. These are some of the requirements. Some of it's embedded with certain types of mathematical formalisms which we use in the design of the system. These are things that the system must adhere to. In the interest of time, I'm basically going to show some of the very, very high-level flow where responsibility must be established before the mission is undertaken by someone who sends it out into the field. We have a piece of the system called the responsibility advisor that ensures that that is done in a well-informed manner. Military necessity is required before engaging a target. You can't just do it because you want to. You have to understand what a low value, medium value, high value targets are, be capable of discriminating that target as a legitimate one, apply the principle of double intention, and compute proportionality associated with that. Well, the principle of double intention is derived from Michael Walzer. So we have these four components: the ethical governor, ethical behavior control, ethical adapter, which actually uses an analog of guilt derived from cognitive psychology to compare different versions of battle damage assessment as the basis for causing a system to stop using a particular weapon. I would argue that McChrystal just recently did this in Afghanistan. Whether he experienced guilt or not is not important, but when they stopped using a particular missile system in response to a large proportion of civilian casualties, that's the same analog that occurs there, and the responsibility advisor. There are multiple scenarios, which I'll just quickly go through. This one based on real life, which deals with Taliban at funeral, where a predator could have engaged these targets, but was forced not to because it violated the rules of engagement in that circumstance. The Apache rules tonight, many of you have probably seen this video. I usually ask my audience how many have seen it, but I don't have time to be able to do that now. Deals with the transition at the very, very end of that for a combatant to switch to hors de combat status, and he was instructed to still neutralize that particular target, to use politically, militarily correct jargon. The deployment of these autonomous systems and the DMZ by a company called Samsung Techwin, and work I'd like to do eventually at Fort Benning in their Mount facility, testing these against human-level performance as well. We've implemented this in Mission Lab, which is our software infrastructure in version 7.0, freely available over the internet. There are narrated videos, if you're interested in seeing this, on our website, which can show it in operation and provide more context for that. Much needs to be done, as I mentioned before, in terms of getting this further than this baby step proof of concept system which I have just described. And in summary, again, it's important that we address this from the onset and be highly proactive from an ethical basis as we develop these systems and move them into the battlefield to make sure that they are following our nation's aspirations and purported aspirations, I must say, to make sure that indeed we encode these principles into the system accordingly. Additional information, of course, is in my book. If you want to go to my website, you can find that information as well, too. There are many other sources. An interesting special issue in IEEE Technology and Society on lethal robots appeared, I think, last December or November as well, too. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ron. I do encourage you to check out Ron's book, Governing Lethal Behavior in Autonomous Robots, on which this presentation is based. It's fascinating stuff, and actually when I first heard of Ron's work, that's what got me in the field of robot ethics. Okay, so to present the next speaker, who I also met a couple years ago, I think at the same conference at Stanford, Dr. Peter Sarro. He is a fellow philosopher of science and technology. He is a founding member and co-director of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. He's also a member of the faculty of the Department of Media Studies and Film at the New School University of New York, and he's currently involved in the design of the natural language interface for the Wolfram Alpha computational knowledge engines. Peter.
Thanks, Okay, so I guess I'm the first philosopher on the panel, so I'm going to give the abstract kind of ethical overview of what I think is the really relevant issues going on with these robotic transformations that we're seeing. And I'm mostly interested in the autonomous lethality that Ron was talking about. And I'm generally set up as his adversarial debate partner in these situations, which is somewhat difficult because we actually agree largely on the framing of the issue and what's really relevant about it. And I guess I would say my argument with him is really that his solution is suboptimal. Maybe for an engineer that's worse than being wrong. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I want to call ethical opportunities. So as we're transforming these technologies, we have opportunities, as Ron pointed out, to say insert ethical technologies directly into the robots. I want to talk about some other approaches we might take, a little bit about unintended consequences, and really I want to talk both about teleoperation, because actually I think some of these teleoperated systems improve ethics in significant ways that we should recognize, and then what the real dangers of autonomous lethality are. And if I have time at the end, a bit about what arms control can do to help us in this situation. So when I think about ethics, it's not really the same thing as responsibility, and very often we think of ethics as individual decision making. Or we think about responsibility as what's an individual's legal responsibility. Can they be charged with a crime? Can they be sued for damages and things like that? And we think very much in terms of individuals in these cases. And what we're doing though when we're building these systems is these are large scale systems that are transforming people's responsibilities. They're transforming their abilities to make choices, what kinds of information they have access to, and what kinds of actions they have access to, and options in terms of the choices that they can make. And all of these things are being transformed when we introduce these new technologies. And what we really want to try to avoid as we're doing this is irresponsibility, right? Not just, well, this robot made a bad choice, but that an individual can be in a position where they're not responsible for the choices, or that when, say, a set of robots go into a city to take it, that who's has that responsibility? If we're saying that the robot is suddenly becoming responsible, or is it a single commander who's responsible for an entire set of robots where they're not necessarily involved in the specific decisions that robot is making? There's a great deal of complexity about who's responsible and then who owns that action, who takes responsibility for certain actions. And within just war theory, as Ron just pointed out, there's the doctrine of double intention, which is that if basically this is what justifies collateral damage. So if you are intending to destroy a military target and you accidentally destroy a non-military target or kill civilians, it's considered ethically and legally acceptable as long as you weren't intending specifically to kill the civilians. But if you have a robot that doesn't have intention, well, then it's never intentionally killing civilians in one sense, unless it was directly ordered to. And so you have this kind of disappearance of the responsibility if a robot runs amok, or if a robot is just used a little too carelessly, or was designed wrong. There's nobody left in that chain of responsibility who's blamable, which in one sense is not unethical. It didn't do anything ethically wrong or legally wrong, but civilians are still killed and bad things happen, and those are technologies we design. So how do we try to avoid that? So if we look at teleoperation, what we're really doing is maintaining, to a certain extent, pre-existing modes of decision making. So we're operating at a distance, but the ultimate question of pulling the trigger, the lethal decision-making process, is still in human hands. Now, some things do get changed. So on the one hand, because of that distance, there's less stress, fear, anxiety, need for vengeance, maybe because you're not at risk individually, and you can take time. And time is a big factor. And we see this with the UAVs now that are doing these missions in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan, that because of the time they're able to linger in the air for dozens of hours and observe potential targets and really wait for all of, say, the civilians around the identified target, which they have a lot more time to properly identify a target. They have a lot more time to wait for that target to be out in the clear where there's less potential for civilian casualties. They can use smaller weapons. All of those things increase the ability to discriminate, the ability to calibrate proportionality, and to also assert, the accuracy of information, the legality of the action, all of those things. And there's several other factors involved besides time, which is the collaboration. So an individual soldier doesn't have to make that decision. A group of soldiers can make that decision. They can also consult with lawyers. They can consult with intelligence analysts and all sorts of other people in that process. So we've increased the ability in these cases to actually make more ethical decisions. And the other aspect is action. So robots have less kinds of actions than the typical warfighter. Warfighters are highly multitasking individuals, right? So they can shoot a gun, but they can put down the gun and they can dress wounds as well, right? They have a lot more functions than their typical robot. Now, we saw some good robots this morning from iRobot that have increasing kinds of sophistication in terms of the kinds of actions they can take. But are we really at a point where a UAV is going to be able to administer medical assistance to civilians who are injured or to soldiers that are injured? And I think that's still a bit off. So that's kind of on the negative side for now. But there's an opportunity to enhance ethical designs by increasing the ability of these systems to engage in other kinds of actions. I want to focus specifically on the interface because I think the interface to these remote systems is really where the ethics transpires, because this is where you get all of your information about what that robot is observing and what its environment is like. And it's also where you control the actions that that robot takes. And I think where I want to say that Ron's argument is suboptimal sort of starts here, which is that if we want to really increase the ethical behavior of soldiers and increase their ethical conduct, we do this by providing them with better information, more useful information, and better options in terms of the actions that they can take. And if we invest in those kinds of technologies, instead of technologies that automate that individual out of the system, then we'll be a lot better off in the long run. There's a lot of challenges to doing that. So one is just the challenges of providing better information, the accuracy and timeliness, relevance, providing them tools for interpreting that quickly and in a way that's useful for the kinds of decisions that they have to make. There's also this providing of the opportunities for collaboration, which I think working at a distance, it really enhances. But you could do that further by making sure that the right people are in the decision loop when lethal decisions need to be made. Okay, and there's also the kind of lifetime learning, so that soldiers, and we don't want to create a situation where we're building technologies that are treating warfighters like the personnel at a McDonald's restaurant, where everything has been super efficiently automated and dumbed down to the least common denominator, so that you just have to press a button that looks like the food and then, present the food, right? That's not what warfighter culture should be like. Warfighter culture should involve virtue, ethics, decisions. We should develop leaders, people who understand how to act in situations, how to manage risk, how to make tough decisions. And if we eliminate that in the lower echelons of warfighting and decision making, then where are we going to get the leadership in the future in the long run that is going to be capable of making those kinds of decisions? And indeed, if we're building computer models of these things, who are we modeling these things after if those people aren't around anymore? There's a wonderful researcher, Mary Cummins at MIT, who was, I believe, a Navy pilot, one of the first combat female Navy pilots. She now works on these interface design ethics issues. She believes what we need to do is sort of more engineering brainstorming about the ethical implications of these. But she also derives a couple of key points, which are that one is this kind of the common notion that this distance includes a moral distance, that as we put the warfighters far away from combat, that you create a moral buffer and they're less engaged with the morality of their actions. And I think from the UAV pilots I've talked to, this is actually not necessarily the case. And it's also because of this time function, that because they're actually observing potential targets for maybe 8 or 10 hours before deciding to pull the trigger and release a missile, that they become sort of intimately engaged with the life of these people in a way that actually does make them very emotionally and morally attached to the situation, and you start to see increased levels of, say, post-traumatic stress involved with that as well. But the one that's really crucial, I think, that she points out is what's called automation bias. And automation bias is that people tend to trust automated systems. So if you automate a system, maybe you've given the user the opportunity or the option to override that system, but they're not inclined to do that because they tend to trust the system. So when you design that system, there's risk for them. They take on additional responsibilities by overriding it. And that's a very dangerous proposition. And the example that she uses in her work is the Patriot missile system, which has an automatic target designation, which you have, 10 or 15 seconds in which you can override that and tell the system not to fire. And in both the cases, there was a tornado and an F-18 that were shot down in Iraq in 2003 by the Patriot system. In both cases, the user decided not to override the system because of this kind of bias. So we want to avoid that. So now sort of transitioning into some of the more automated notions, but I think Ron's ideas can really be applied both to teleoperated systems as well, and especially this idea of the responsibility advisor and what he calls the ethical governor. So I don't think it's a bad idea to build a set of, say, ethical rules into the robot where the robot is going to say, hey, this violates the Geneva Conventions, I'm not going to do it. I think that's perfectly fine, and that would be a great kind of override system, even if there's a human controller who sells the system to take a certain action. And the ethical governor kicks in and says, no, that violates this Geneva Convention. I think that would be a great system to have. And then the responsibility advisor, which, as I read the paper that you published on that, it strikes me that what it does is try to inform the user of what exactly they're taking responsibility for when they press that button. But it's a bit like those end-user license agreements whenever you install a new piece of software and there's 20 pages of text and you just want to click OK so you can move on to the next screen. I think there's a danger of that, of like, how do we actually create an interface that informs the user of what that responsibility is, and not just informs them that they're taking on some responsibility that they can't fathom, but the system actually allows them to be responsible. It gives them the information they need to make responsible decisions. And I think that's where we should invest technology. So within trying to think about arms control or trying to think about the ethics or legality of using these kinds of systems, it tends to break down into discrimination and proportionality. And I think within these automated systems, we're going to see probably pretty good performance at some point on discrimination tasks. And that, though, is not then implying that we should let the robot actually make the ultimate decision, but we can use those tools to help also to inform users. So I don't know if some of you may have seen the recent WikiLeaks video, but if there were an automated system on the Apache that could distinguish telephoto lenses from RPGs, that would just pop up a little something on the screen that says this is not an RPG, this is a telephoto lens, that could have changed the outcome of that situation in a dramatic way. Proportionality, I think, is much more difficult. It's not easily quantifiable, although there are frameworks in which, within the military, that they do create equations and formulas and processes and things to assess proportionality and assign these values and determine whether certain, say, bombing targets are valid and things like that. But there's a whole lot of human work that goes into constructing those that tends to get missed if you just look at the equation that comes out at the end process. And I don't know that we should really want robots to be making those kinds of decisions. And I think there's multiple reasons that we need a lot of contextual information. Situations are incredibly complex. How you assess values is very complex, and it's not necessarily something that should be automated. In terms of the autonomous lethality, I think what ethics is really about is about deliberation. It's really a set of tools that we've created over human history to help people make decisions. And much the way the law is a set of rules we've come up to kind of govern human behavior and regulate it. And this technology is going to require a new approach to thinking about how we make ethical decisions, because now we're separating decision-making from action. And if we go the automation route, it's a whole nother level of complexity, or a whole nother revolution, if you will, in terms of ethical thinking, which is how do we pre-think deliberation and try to build that into a system? Because the system's not going to deliberate. The system's going to follow a set of rules. And ethics is really designed to help human brains deliberate issues. So it's a bit artificial to take a set of rules that come out of that process and put it into a system that's just going to follow them mechanically and logically. And we lose responsibility in that process. We also redistribute risk, which is a whole other issue. So the second part of my argument, I think the optimal solution consists of two things. One is to invest technological research into enhancing the information and allowing warfighters to be more responsible in the decisions that they make, rather than automating away that lethal decision making. And the second part of that is that we should probably have an international arms control regime for regulating autonomous lethal decision making. Because the only other argument in favor of it is that, well, the other guys are going to do it. The enemies are going to do it, and there's going to be a race, and we have to be on the front end of that race. But if we're able to create an international arms control regime, we can stop that arms race. So there's various, very good reasons why this is in the interest of the U.S., even though we're right now, I believe, at the forefront of robotics technology, and could very well be at the forefront of the autonomous robotics lethal technology. The question is whether we want to be, and what happens when everybody else follows us. There's the strong possibility for short-circuiting of conflicts. And I think the real danger is not simply that the beginning of accidental wars, which is, I think, the most obvious case if we have, say, UAVs, armed UAVs patrolling both sides of the Indian-Pakistani border, and they suddenly, one gets blown off course, they find themselves engaged. What happens next? So there's the actual incident. But the other big problem with this automation is escalation. So does a robot know when it's escalating a situation? Do we allow robots to escalate situations? And do we allow those to escalate without any kind of human supervision and control? And I think that's a huge issue that should be regulated by international law. The more classic kind of fail-safe Strangelove problem, that these systems will just sort of run amok. And the proliferation problem. So if we invest massively into designing these technologies, which are highly sophisticated at identifying humans, killing humans, these become software pieces or easily distributable hardware pieces, there's going to be proliferation. And the more sophisticated these things are, the more deadly they'll be when they're used against us. And they're already proliferating pretty robustly. It's very different than a nuclear technology, which requires a giant industrial complex to build. So with these things can be downloaded on the internet, we're in real trouble. There's also the problem of, which we're going to hear, I guess, a panel tomorrow on cyber warfare, and we heard a bit this morning already. Well, these systems, if they're fully automated, are also fully hackable, which they have no loyalties. And once you take it over, you've taken it over, and not only can you disable it, but you can actually use it against the person that created it. And I think that's a major risk that has to be assessed. And there's the more general problem of the asymmetric warfare, which we've already sort of heard a little bit about. But the idea that if you're totally removed from the battlefield, or if you don't have any soldiers involved in combat directly, this actually does start to challenge some of the foundational principles of just war theory. So the whole distinction between combatants and non-combatants is leveraged on this idea that you've offered yourself, you put yourself at risk to some extent by engaging in war, or you've set aside a portion of your population and you're calling them combatants, and you're letting them fight the battle. But if all of your combatants become civilians, then everybody's a civilian, so your enemies are not justified in attacking civilians. And so at what ratio do you cross that line? Is it 1% can be combatants? Do you just put a few token people out on the battlefield to be targets? There's all sorts of strange consequences of that kind of argument, but it's definitely an issue, and it's something that operates within the mass psychology and within public opinion, regardless of what you think personally the ethical truth is. Okay, so, and there's also the kind of notion that putting all these systems into teleoperated kind of video game-like remote control will make the users or the warfighters very dispassionate. They'll act like they're playing video games. This is from Sir Brian Burridge, who was the commander of the Royal Air Force during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He's concerned about this because he sees this in pilots that aren't trained as in-plane pilots, but only as UAV pilots who have a lot of difficulty understanding the rules of the road and how to share airspace. So I'll just end with a brief overview of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. We've just organized a small organizing committee in the last year. We're going to be having a conference in September. My main goal with this organization is to really try to create an international treaty on the model of the Ottawa Treaty for anti-personnel landmines, which would make autonomous lethal decision-making of the kind I've been talking about illegal for everybody, and that would prevent arms races, hopefully, in that area. And I think it will work. So, and I think the U.S. should lead because they're in the best position to do this. I think it's in the military interest to do this. And we have the best potential as the leaders of the technology to start this initiative. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, our final panelist is Brigadier General Rick O'Meara. Rick O'Meara is a retired from the U.S. Army but was a combat veteran in the Vietnam War. Following his Vietnam service, he earned his law degree and joined the Judge Advocate General's Court. So not only